Water is not a runway. Water is a liquid wall. When a machine weighing nearly 40 tons tries to break free from the deadly grip of the Pacific Ocean, the laws of physics turn into pure aggression. The engines roar at full strain. Sheets of duralumin groan under colossal pressure. Seawater slams into the cockpit windows with the density of wet concrete. Inside the pilot's cabin of the Boeing 314 Clipper flying boat, the crew grips the control yokes, waiting for that single microsecond when the hydrodynamic step, a special ledge on the bottom of the fuselage, breaks the vacuum grip of the ocean. A sharp pull toward themselves. The monstrous vibration vanishes instantly. The deafening roar of the waves gives way to the steady, almost hypnotic hum of 4 radial engines. In the passenger cabin, stewards in snow-white uniforms calmly pour champagne into crystal glasses, perfectly balanced on the thick carpet. The year is 1939. Pan American Airways has just forced the planet to shrink in size. Yet in a quiet office on the 58th floor of the Chrysler Building in New York, the man who engineered this triumph is already studying drawings that will either make him the absolute king of the post-war world or destroy his empire. His name is Juan Trippe. He is a visionary, a monopolist, and a ruthless businessman. Trippe does not want simply to fly over oceans. He wants to own them. The Boeing 314 flying boat is an engineering masterpiece, but for Trippe, it is already hopelessly obsolete. He needs a successor. He needs a machine so monstrously large that it can carry hundreds of passengers across the Atlantic in the absolute luxury of a flying hotel. Decades later, aviation mythology and sensation-hungry journalists will call this phantom the 3-deck Super Clipper. Urban legends will paint the image of an unthinkable 3-story Leviathan, with separate dining rooms, promenade decks, and private staterooms, whose drawings supposedly gathered dust in secret archives. But the truth is far darker, more complex, and more interesting than any myth. The real Successor was a machine born of the harshest compromise. It was a project that trapped the brightest minds in aviation inside their own genius. Why did the greatest ocean liner of the skies, designed to outlast any competitor, become the reason the era of flying boats died in a single night? To understand how an airplane can be killed not by a catastrophe, but by the very element it was meant to conquer, one must return to the moment when an impossible task was set. By 1941, Europe is engulfed in flames. But Juan Trippe is already thinking about the day after the war ends. He sends out a confidential memorandum to the leading aircraft manufacturers of the United States of America. The technical specification reads like science fiction. Pan American demands an intercontinental transport capable of flying from New York to London without refueling, carrying a payload equal to the weight of 3 standard railroad cars. The level of comfort must surpass that of ocean liners, and most importantly, it must absolutely be a flying boat. For Juan Trippe, the ocean is a free, endless runway that does not need to be paved, repaired, or protected from enemy bombers. No government will be able to charge him taxes for landing on water. In design bureaus, engineers look at the provided figures and realize that they are being asked to repeal the laws of nature. Water does not forgive mistakes. To lift such a colossal weight, a hull of unimaginable volume is needed. But a massive boat hull creates fatal resistance in the air. Engineers find themselves in a vicious circle of hydrodynamics and aerodynamics. Make the boat narrow and streamlined. It will flip over on takeoff or bury its nose in a wave. Make it wide and stable. It will barely be able to drag itself through the sky, burning mountains of fuel. The public would later invent absurd 9-deck concepts, but the engineers at Consolidated Aircraft, under the leadership of Isaac Macklin Ladden, respond to Juan Tripp's challenge with cold reality. They propose the Model 37. No 3 decks. Instead, they create a concept of a colossal fuselage in the shape of a double bubble, or figure 8, where 2 enormous cylinders merge into one, forming 2 giant decks. 6 gigantic engines, a wingspan equal to the height of a 20-story building. This is a true flying cathedral, designed for 204 passengers. Juan Tripp is delighted. Preliminary contracts are ready. It seems that the future of aviation will forever belong to giant flying boats. But at the same time, on the other side of the country, Boeing's chief designer, Wellwood Beale, looks at the same problem from an entirely different angle. Boeing engineers, quietly designing bombers for the upcoming world battles, begin to notice what Juan Tripp, in his blind obsession with oceans, refuses to see. The race to create the ultimate superclipper begins. Neither the brilliant customer nor the great engineers yet suspect that they are designing a magnificent tombstone. They are about to spend millions of dollars and thousands of sleepless nights fighting aerodynamics, unaware that the true killer of their dream already waits in the shadows. The future of flying boats will be killed not by gravity or headwinds. They will be destroyed by the quiet, invisible chemical reaction of sea salt and the endless miles of dull, gray concrete that the military is right now pouring all across the planet. Engineering drafting boards in the Consolidated Aircraft Design Bureau are buried under mountains of sketches. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the acrid smell of ammonia from copying machines. Chief designer Isaac Macklin Ladden looks at the drawings of the Model 37 and understands that Juan Tripp has not ordered him an airplane. The head of Pan American has ordered a Leviathan. To lift 120 tons of metal off the water, a mass equivalent to the weight of 40 adult elephants, Ladden has to take radical measures. A classic round fuselage will not work here. At an altitude of 6 kilometers, passengers would simply suffocate if the cabin were not pressurized. But if one tries to inflate a gigantic flat box with air, it will not withstand the pressure difference and will burst at the seams. Ladden and his exhausted engineers find a brilliant but frighteningly complex solution. In cross-section, they draw the figure 8. 2 gigantic cylinders overlap each other, forming the shape of a double soap bubble. The upper deck is intended for the bulk of the passengers, while the lower deck turns into a luxurious recreation area, with a bar and a long promenade corridor. No mythical 3 decks that the tabloid press would shout about decades later. Only 2. But the space was such that 204 people could freely roam above the Atlantic Ocean, while stewards prepared hot meals in a full onboard galley, listening to the steady drone outside. This luxury demanded monstrous power. On the wing, whose span exceeded the length of a hockey rink by nearly 1.5 times, Ladden placed 6 monstrous radial engines. Each of them delivered 3,500 horsepower. In total, this provided enough energy to move and accelerate an average ocean destroyer. When this giant was to start its engines, the sound would resemble a local earthquake. The pilots in the cockpit would feel their seats trembling slightly from the rough, unbridled primordial force. It seemed that the ideal machine for total dominance in the sky had been created. But in this engineering triumph, a deadly disease had already been embedded. The name of this disease is the hydrodynamic compromise. The great idea stumbled over the laws of physics. The ocean is a cruel master. It never releases what has submerged into it without a fight. To make 120 tons take off, The lower part of the fuselage must have the shape of a boat, but most importantly, the bottom must have a step. This is a special sharp ledge, a deep transverse cut on the very belly of the aircraft. At a speed of 93 miles per hour, it is this ledge that breaks the water's vacuum adhesion, creating an air cavity under the bottom. It allows the heavy machine to slide off the water surface into the sky. Without the step, takeoff is physically impossible. A smooth boat will simply endlessly plow the water until the last liter of aviation fuel is burned. But as soon as the flying boat lifts off the waves and reaches cruising altitude, this life-saving step turns into a curse. In the air, this ledge acts as a constantly open braking parachute. A land-based airplane takes off, retracts its smooth landing gear into the fuselage, and turns into an ideal droplet, silently gliding through the atmosphere. The flying boat is forced to drag its enormous water brake across the entire ocean. It consumes thousands of gallons of precious fuel just to overcome the resistance of its own bottom. Ladin knew about this flaw. Juan Trippe knew about it, but they stubbornly considered it an inevitable price for independence from ground infrastructure. They were critically mistaken. Worse, they underestimated another invisible and merciless enemy: sea salt. Duralumin is a magnificent aviation material, incredibly light and strong. But in combination with warm ocean salt water, it begins to slowly and painfully rot. Maintenance of Pan American's giant flying boats had already turned into a daily financial nightmare. Aviation mechanics had to work knee-deep in aggressive salt water, scraping algae deposits and spots of corrosion from the hulls for hours. Every landing in the open ocean was Russian roulette. A random half-submerged log hidden beneath the foam of the waves could pierce the thin bottom and send the multi-million-dollar machine to the bottom in mere minutes. Flying boats were not airplanes in the usual sense. They were ships, and ships require shipyards, protected harbors, support boats, and entire armies of dock workers. The economics of this process were bursting at the seams. And while Juan Trippe stubbornly demanded that engineers refine the concept of a gigantic flying boat, in the design bureau of Boeing in Seattle, a quiet but merciless revolution was taking place. Chief designer Wellwood Beale, a man with an exceptionally cold and pragmatic mind, looked at the world map redrawn by the fire of the Second World War, and he saw what would forever change the rules of the game in aviation. The war forced the engineering troops of the United States of America and their allies to cut down impenetrable jungles, raise hills, and pour millions of tons of concrete across the entire globe. In Hawaii, in devastated Europe, on remote atolls of the Pacific Ocean, everywhere, like mushrooms after the rain, long, straight, incredibly hard runways appeared. The ocean was no longer the only available and free road. Concrete turned out to be more reliable, safer, and absolutely free for commercial airlines, because the state built these colossal strips for its heavy bombers. Beale makes a decision that forever buries the maritime romance. Boeing officially abandons the concept of giant seaplanes. Instead of fighting steps, salt, and unpredictable waves, the engineers take their most deadly masterpiece, the heavy bomber Boeing B-29, the very same legendary airplane that would ultimately drop atomic bombs on Japanese cities. They take its ideal, aerodynamically flawless wing. They take its powerful turbo-supercharged engines and tail assembly, and then, onto this platform of death, they mount a completely new, massive passenger fuselage, built according to that same double-bubble scheme. The land-based concept, Boeing 377, is born. No boat hulls, no water resistance, only gleaming metal, retractable landing gear, and pure aerodynamics, unburdened by compromises. The irony of fate strikes hard. The greatest symbol of luxury, The true successor to the elegant pre-war clippers is now literally stitched together from pieces of a war machine. Passengers of the future will drink expensive champagne and smoke cigars in a cozy lounge on the lower deck, without even suspecting that the wings carrying them through the cold night at an altitude of 6 kilometers were originally designed to carry death and destruction on an unimaginable scale. Boeing offered airlines speed, economy, and pressurization that were unavailable to any flying boat on the planet. Pragmatism killed the dream of aerial ocean liners, turning a bomber into a palace. Juan Trippe faces a terrible choice. His pride, his maniacal dream of ocean monopoly, requires him to continue funding the project from Consolidated. He sees these grandiose drawings of a 200-passenger seaplane, and his heart yearns to see this bird cut through the waves. But the dry, soulless calculations of government economists reveal the cruel truth. A land-based airplane will cost many times less to maintain. It will fly faster because it has no hydrodynamic brake on its belly. It will climb significantly higher than dangerous storm clouds. The era when aviation tried to befriend the ocean has come to an end. But history rarely goes without final, desperate attempts to prove the relentless progress wrong. While Boeing confidently assembles its land-based airliners, somewhere in a huge wooden hangar, another monster is being born. A machine that was supposed to eclipse everything other engineers had designed. An apparatus that would become a symbol of the greatest stubbornness in human history, and turn the grandiose idea of a giant flying boat into a tragic monument. A man enters the arena whose financial resources and technical madness surpassed even the unimaginable ambitions of Juan Trippe. He is going to build his own giant cathedral of wood and glue to throw the last challenge to the laws of common sense, gravity, and the coming era of concrete. The ocean was preparing to receive its last, most peculiar king. November 1947. Long Beach Harbor in the state of California is shrouded in dense morning fog. The air is saturated with the smell of salt, seaweed, and the acrid chemical aroma of formaldehyde glue. On the leaden surface of the water bobs an apparatus whose dimensions the human brain refuses to perceive. Its wingspan far exceeds the length of a football field. Its tail rises above the dark water to the height of an 8-story building. This is the Hughes Hercules, the grandiose creation of the eccentric billionaire Howard Hughes. The newspaper writers mockingly dubbed this incredible machine the Spruce Goose, although it was built entirely of composite birch. Inside the colossal cockpit, whose dimensions more closely resemble a ship's bridge, sits Hughes himself. Next to him, the flight engineer swallows nervously, staring at hundreds of trembling needles on the instrument panels. No one in the world until this moment had attempted to fly a flying boat of such size. His hands rest on the throttles of 8 enormous radial engines. Each of them holds the unbridled power of 3,000 horsepower. Hughes intends to prove to the entire world, to the government of the United States of America, and to Juan Trippe, that super-heavy flying boats have a right to exist, that metal can be replaced by wood, and that straight concrete runways can never replace absolute ocean freedom. The engines start. The sound resembles a continuous artillery barrage from heavy guns. 8 enormous 4-bladed propellers begin furiously chopping the moist ocean air, raising an impenetrable wall of blinding white spray around the wooden leviathan. Hughes smoothly advances the throttles. The colossal mass of 180 tons reluctantly begins to move. Inside the empty fuselage, where 2 fully equipped infantry battalions could have been comfortably accommodated, stands a deafening, primordial roar. The entire structure creaks. The wood groans under the assault of brutal hydrodynamic resistance. This is not an elegant flight. It is a savage wrestling match between human pride and the incredible density of water. Speed slowly increases. 43 miles per hour. 62. 81. The pilot physically feels the massive hydrodynamic step on the bottom of the hull slamming into the oncoming waves, trying to break the surface tension. The water resists, claws at the hull with invisible talons, unwilling to release its prey. And suddenly, the aggressive vibration ceases completely. At an altitude of only 65 feet above the water's surface, the colossal machine lifts off the bay. It flies. For a distance of 1.5 kilometers, the giant wooden cathedral glides heavily through the cold air. The crowd of journalists and onlookers on the shore erupts in ecstatic cheers. Howard Hughes has proven that his monster is capable of rising into the sky. But at the very second when the bottom of the Hercules touches the water again, raising gigantic fountains of spray, the era of giant passenger flying boats dies once and for all. This short, wrenching hop over Long Beach Harbor became not a triumphant beginning of a new era, but a magnificent, tragic salute at its lavish funeral. Hughes shut down the hot engines and stepped out to the reporters as an absolute victor. But deep in his soul, he knew the terrible truth. His airplane was too heavy, too slow, and unbearably difficult to handle. This giant would never rise into the sky again. Not once in history. Meanwhile, in Washington, in the quiet offices of the Civil Aeronautics Board of the United States of America, officials are drawing up the dry mathematical conclusion of this romantic era. Before them lie official government reports on North Atlantic routes, and these documents are more merciless than any air disaster. Numbers have no feelings, and they deliver the final death sentence. Experts meticulously calculated the cost per passenger mile for different types of aviation equipment. Land-based airliners from Douglas and Lockheed, taking off from perfectly smooth concrete runways, burned 25% less fuel. They did not require expensive port facilities with piers. They did not need divers for regular inspections of the bottom for leaks. Airlines no longer had to maintain huge armies of mechanics who, every day, standing waist-deep in cold water, cleaned duralumin of algae and metal-eating sea salt. Insurance for a land-based airplane cost dozens of times less, because an emergency landing at an alternate concrete airfield in case of bad weather was a routine procedure. For a flying boat, a storm at the point of arrival meant certain death, because safely landing 120 tons on raging 13-foot waves is physically impossible. Quantripp reads these government reports and realizes that his great dream has imperceptibly turned into a black hole for capital. He picks up the phone, calls the engineers at Consolidated, and utters the words that forever put an end to the most ambitious project in commercial aviation. Orders for the construction of the giant Model 37 are ruthlessly cancelled. The drawings of the two-deck Leviathan, capable of carrying 204 passengers through storms, are sent to dusty archival folders, where, years later, they will acquire absurd myths about non-existent 3-decks. Not a single piece of aviation metal was ever cut for the civilian version. Not a single rivet gun ever struck the smooth skin. The murder took place in the absolute silence of offices, solely with the help of accounting books and profitability graphs. Boring economics turned out to be a far more effective executioner than the laws of aerodynamics. Pan American Airways, gritting its teeth, transfers its transoceanic routes to land. They purchase those very land-based Boeing 377s. The luxury that Tripp had so maniacally dreamed of is preserved. but in an entirely different form. Passengers now ascend stable ramps from solid, reliable concrete. They settle into soft seats inside a pressurized fuselage, stitched according to the precise patterns of the heavy military bomber Boeing B-29. Descending the spiral staircase to the lower lounge, they leisurely drink dry martinis and smoke expensive cigars, without even realizing that they are inside a structure originally created for the total destruction of entire cities. And below, 6 kilometers beneath them, the leaden waves of the Atlantic rage. The ocean, once the sole support and hope of global aviation, has now become merely a beautiful backdrop beyond the round window, a frightening dark abyss over which one must fly as quickly as possible. In this story lies an incredible, almost cruel irony of fate. The aeroplanes, brilliantly designed to save global logistics from the shortage of airfields, disappeared precisely because the most bloody war in human history left behind a perfected ground infrastructure. Bombers paved a safe path for civilian airliners. The ingenious solutions of engineers who for years tried to combine a huge ship and a winged aeroplane did not fail due to the stupidity of their creators or ignorance of physics. They simply became victims of a rapidly changing world. A world in which time suddenly became incomparably more valuable than the maritime romance of quiet ocean harbors. The great flying boats taught humanity not to fear crossing bottomless oceans. They gave people the sincere belief that the vast planet could be circled in just a few days. But as soon as they fulfilled their historical mission, relentless progress turned away from them with cold ingratitude. Howard Hughes's wooden monster froze in a dark hangar as a mute monument to human stubbornness. The paper drawings of the superclippers moldered in the archives, forever closing the intrigue about unrealized palaces above the waves. The boundless sky finally and unconditionally came to belong to machines that were born on land and always returned to solid earth, leaving the ocean only its slow steel ships. Somewhere on the scorching concrete slabs of Kelly Air Force Base in the state of Texas, the summer haze mercilessly distorts the line of the horizon. The year is 1949. The air trembles from unbearable heat and the smell of burning rubber. Engineers from Consolidated Aircraft, whose boldest ambitions had once been inseparably linked to the conquest of raging oceans, now stand on dry, solid ground and squint as they gaze into the blindingly clear sky. Through dense layers of hot air, an enormous silvery silhouette approaches them with a deafening, low roar. This machine possesses painfully familiar contours. The very same incredible double-bubble fuselage, the same grandiose dimensions capable of accommodating a gigantic crowd of people. But beneath the belly of this leviathan, there is no hydrodynamic step. There is not a single hint of a boat hull ready to slice through ocean waves. Instead, from beneath the colossal metal belly, massive landing gear struts descend with a heavy clang, crowned with enormous rubber wheels. The airplane touches the scorching concrete, leaving behind thick clouds of bluish smoke from the skidding tires. This is the XC-99, a heavy military transport aircraft created for the United States Air Force. This is the very same legendary Model 37, the very same mythical Super Clipper of Juan Trippe, but ruthlessly stripped of its maritime soul. The engineers proved that their monstrous two-deck concept was capable of flight. It could lift into the air a cargo equal to the weight of an entire herd of adult elephants. It successfully delivered hundreds of tons of ammunition and military equipment, but it did so exclusively over the solid surface of the Earth. The irony of fate materialized in metal. The ingenious fuselage, designed to become the most luxurious ocean liner of the skies, ultimately turned into a workhorse for military logisticians, forever chained to endless miles of gray military concrete. Parallel to this, on civilian transoceanic routes, that same compromised land-based Boeing 377 Stratocruiser begins to dictate its merciless rules. Passengers of Pan American Airways truly receive the promised luxury. They sleep in proper beds, descend the spiral staircase into the exquisite lounge on the lower deck, where stewards pour iced cocktails. Inside the pressurized cabin, it is warm and quiet, while outside the windows, a deadly frost rages at an altitude of 23,000 feet. But this comfort comes at a bloody price, paid by the technical staff. Aviation cruelly avenges any attempt to cheat time and space. The Pratt & Whitney engines installed on this airplane receive among the exhausted mechanics the grim nickname of corncobs. Each of the 4 engines packs 28 cylinders tightly inside. 448 spark plugs per airplane. Servicing these monsters becomes a genuine engineering hell. The engines overheat, oil flows in streams, carburetors freeze, and propellers occasionally tear off right in flight, piercing the pressurized fuselage skin with a horrifying whistle of escaping air. Crews exist in a state of constant, exhausting tension. The great era of piston-powered luxury, built on the foundation of military bombers, proves fragile, temperamental, and unbearably expensive to operate. Pragmatism killed the romance of flying boats, but gave birth to a technological monster that devoured pilots' nerves and airline budgets at no slower a rate. Juan Trippe, sitting in his corner office on the 58th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, looks at the financial reports and realizes that once again he must kill his favorite child so his empire can survive. He no longer dreams of ocean harbors and flying boats. He no longer believes in giant piston engines, no matter how powerful they may be. His gaze is fixed on the future that is already beginning to tear through the sound barrier with a roar. On Boeing's drawing boards, an entirely new predator is already taking shape. It has swept wings, a fuselage smooth as a bullet, and turbojet engines containing not a single piston. This is the future Boeing 707, the airplane that will finally destroy the very notion of slow, luxurious travel. It will turn a flight across the Atlantic from a multi-day, epic adventure with overnight stops into a fast, utilitarian, and incredibly dull 6-hour leap through the stratosphere. Luxurious sleeping berths will disappear, giving way to tightly packed rows of seats. Flying palaces will turn into flying buses, and Juan Trippe, the man whose ambitions once gave birth to the most beautiful aerial leviathans in human history, would personally sign a check for a multi-million-dollar sum to purchase these jet pipes and forever turn the page of world history. Thus, the central intrigue of our story closes. Why did the greatest attempt to create the ideal ocean liner of the skies lead to the complete destruction of the very concept of flying boats? The answer lies in human nature and our eternal striving for absolute dominance over the elements. Engineers and visionaries tried to impose the laws of the sea upon the sky. They wanted the air to submit to the rules of naval architecture, to turn the airplane into a ship. But the sky does not forgive excess weight, and water does not forgive high speed. The attempt to cross 2 entirely different physical media at the peak of their technological limits resulted in a compromise that proved unviable. The flying boat was a magnificent instrument for exploring an unknown world, for laying down the first timid routes across empty spaces. But once the world had been explored, once it had been paved in an even layer of concrete, the need for universal machines disappeared. The perfection of the land-based airplane lay in its narrow specialization. It did not need to know how to swim. It only needed to fly. Aviation had come of age and mercilessly cast aside its romantic childhood illusions. Today, as you sit in the cramped seat of a modern jet airliner, hurtling over the leaden waters of the Pacific Ocean at a speed of 560 miles per hour, look out the small round window. There, in the cold and dark abyss, dozens of miles below, rolls its gigantic waves the element that was once the chief ally and most fearsome enemy of the first conquerors of the sky. The ocean remained unconquered. It simply became unnecessary. The ghosts of Pan American's great flying boats, with their crystal glasses, promenade decks, and roaring engines, dissolved forever into the salty mists of the past. They were incredible, absurd, beautiful, and doomed machines. Machines that, through their grandiose death, proved to us one simple truth. True progress often looks not like the appearance of something more complex and enormous, but like the ruthless rejection of what we loved most, in the name of cold, calculated, and relentless efficiency. A rusty wire fence on the distant outskirts of Kelly Air Force Base in Texas conceals one of the saddest sights in the history of world engineering. Under the merciless southern sun, amid scorched grass and red dust, the very same XC-99 slowly died for decades. The only metal embodiment of the grand Super Clipper project, the machine that was meant to become the most luxurious flying hotel in history, ended its days as a gigantic aluminum corpse. The wind whistled mournfully through the colossal fuselage, built to the double bubble design, where 204 passengers, crystal chandeliers, and promenade decks had once been planned. Instead of the aroma of expensive cigars and French perfumes, this empty hangar, with wings filled with the smell of rotting wiring, bird droppings, and machine oil. The United States Air Force ruthlessly operated this giant for 11 years, forcing it to transport tanks, disassembled airplanes, and blood for wounded soldiers. It flew more than 930,000 miles without a single crash. But when its piston engines finally wore out and jet transports took their place, the military simply rolled it out to the back lot and forgot about it. The metal created to soar above the clouds and challenge Atlantic storms proved powerless against slow corrosion and human indifference. The gigantic two-deck monster, larger than anything ever built for commercial aviation at the time, was ruthlessly cut into pieces for scrap. Nothing remained of Isaac Macklin Ladden's great dream, except a few yellowed drawings and a pair of grainy black-and-white photographs in the archives. The fate of its successful competitor, the land-based Boeing 377 airliner, turned out to be even more surreal and like a cruel joke of history. When the relentless jet age arrived in the early 1960s, these luxurious piston palaces became obsolete in a single day. Pan American Airways hurriedly wrote them off, selling them at scrap metal prices. It seemed these airplanes, stitched together from aggressive military bombers to create an illusion of ocean comfort, would vanish forever in smelting furnaces. But human folly knows no bounds. The eccentric pilot and businessman, Jack Conroy, looked at these retired machines and saw in them not trash, but opportunity. He purchased several old Stratocruisers and instructed the engineers to commit an act of absolute technological vandalism. They took the fuselage, once famous for its elegant profile, cut it in half, and built atop it an unthinkable, grotesque dome. The new airplane received the humiliating but incredibly accurate nickname, Pregnant Guppy. The aerodynamics of this machine defied all laws of physics. It looked like an inflated whale to which wings had been mistakenly attached. But it was precisely this ugly mutant, born from the remnants of the great era of piston-powered luxury that accomplished what no elegant jet airliner had been able to do. At that time, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was desperately trying to send a man to the moon. Engineers had created the colossal stages of the Saturn V rocket, but they faced a mundane logistics problem. These components were too enormous to be transported by train and too fragile for a journey by barge through the Panama Canal. And then the pregnant guppy came to the rescue. The very same airplane that had begun its life as a bomber, then turned into a luxurious substitute for flying boats, now became a flying warehouse for spacecraft. The machine that had failed to conquer the ocean helped humanity step into the vacuum of space. The irony of fate reached its absolute peak. Pilots seated in the cramped cockpit of the Guppy felt how heavily and reluctantly this bloated structure lifted off the ground, carrying inside it elements of the lunar module. They flew slowly, ponderously, under the deafening roar of old radial engines, charting a path to the stars on the ruins of Juan Tripp's transoceanic dream. And what became of the pioneers? Of those very same elegant Boeing 314 flying boats, for whose replacement this entire engineering race had been launched, a race that ultimately destroyed seaplane aviation. Their end was the most tragic and inglorious. Not a single example of this masterpiece